Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rich, Frankie, and Barbara, wherever you are, for putting this together. As you can see, the economy has worn me down. No, it's true. A year and a half ago, I was 6'2", taking a lot out of me. My real handicap, and I should be very clear with you about this, is that I have spent the last 30 years doing economic policy. And an economist is somebody who did not have the personality to become an accountant. How many people did I just insult? Put up your hand, please. You know, I'm sorry about that. No, I was asked to come and talk about the economy, and in a festival whose theme is laughter. Now today, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I used to be head of Secretary of Labor. Today, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the unemployment rate nationally for October was 10.2%. 10.2%. Now, 10.2% really, and I don't want to put anybody. I don't want to rob you of your exuberant, upbeat feelings right now. But 10.2% is actually understates the true level of unemployment, because actually it doesn't include all the people who are too discouraged even to look for work. And it doesn't include the people who are working part-time, who'd rather be working full-time. It doesn't include the people who are working full-time but working only 32, 33 hours a week. The work week is now at a historic short period of time. It doesn't include all the people who have left one job and are now working full-time at another job but working at a lower pay. If you add up all of those people, the actual number of people, or the rate of people who are underemployed, not just unemployed but underemployed, is closer to 20%. This is no laughing matter. Now, how do we get out of this? What is the way out? I mean, here's the essential problem. When you have this many people who are unemployed, but not only that, when you have over the long term so many people who basically have not had a raise, the median wage in the United States right now, for those who are still employed, is not much higher adjusted for inflation than it was 30 years ago. And so, if you take away their one way of buying, which was basically to go deeper and deeper into debt, and that kind of exploded, right? You remember that. That was a housing bubble, and people were using their houses as sort of ATMs. But once the housing bubble is over and they can no longer do that, and people have to go back to basically the same, adjusted for inflation, level of wages, or not much different from what they had 30 years ago, and on top of that, they've got to get out from under a big debt load, and on top of that, they've got to start saving because they haven't saved. And some of those are baby boomers, and I'll get to those in a moment. But you see that there may not be enough demand in the system because consumers are 70% of the economy. There may not be enough demand in the system to keep the economy going. And that is one of the very deep problems we have. And where does demand come from? Well, demand comes from, if not consumers, then it comes from business investments. But how many businesses are going to invest if consumers are not going to be able to buy? And if it's not coming from consumers and it's not coming from business investment, then it comes from exports. But export markets are almost dead in the water. I mean, other countries are still struggling with a recession. That some of them are coming out of it faster than we are, but they're still struggling. And so what is the only remaining source of consumer demand? Government. Government as, in effect, the consumer of last resort. You got it right. Good for you, class. But here's the problem, because there is also something called a deficit. And how can government continue to be the buyer of last resort? In fact, government really needs to go into, in a way, into deeper debt. I mean, John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist who talked about all of this during the 1930s, he was discredited for many years. He's now being exhumed. because he was the one who said government does have got to go, it has got to go into debt. I remember, I mean, when I was a boy, in the early 50s, my father said to me, he said, and this was my first economic lesson, my father was a staunch Republican. And my father said to me, in those days he was, and my father said to me, Bobby, you and your children and your grandchildren will be paying for the debts of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, I was 5. I didn't know what a debt was. But it kept me up at night. Now, in 1945, the debt was, as a proportion of the national economy, was about 120% of the national economy. I mean, that's big. That's big, big debt. I mean, today, it's around 50, 55%. It's not great. In fact, we're heading toward big debt, but it's not nearly that big. As a percentage of the national economy, the debt then was gigantic, and yet, during the 1950s, as a proportion of the national economy, it started shrinking. And that wasn't entirely or even primarily because the United States was paying less for military. We had a Cold War, we had a Korean War. I mean, the government was still buying a lot and paying a lot and spending a lot. No, the major reason the debt dropped as a percentage of the total economy in the 1950s was that the economy was growing so fast. Do you get me? The real issue is debt as a percentage of the national economy. And if your national economy is back on track, if it's growing again, then the debt is easy to manage. The problem is, right now, the national economy is going nowhere. Yes, we're seeing a little bit of growth, but that's a little bit of growth is because we're so down deep in a pit. We get a little bit of growth, but we've got to really get the economy back on track and get people hired and get people in jobs before we can possibly get control over the debt. So the long-term debt is a problem, but the short-term debt right now is not a problem. In fact, in the short term, we've got to go even to the deeper debt. No. But this is very, very controversial. A lot of people do not agree. A lot of people don't think government can do it. I mean, don't think government can do anything responsibly. Government, well, after all, politics comes from the Greek root poly, meaning many, and ticks. Small, blood-sucking insects. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that. Well, Michael Moscow, you don't know this around him, but Michael was Undersecretary of Labor in the Ford administration, and he worked in the Nixon administration, and Michael worked in a lot of Republican administrations. And I know that some of you might be Republicans, and I want you to know that I respect you. I don't like you, but I respect you. No, that's not true. That is not true. I like you and I respect you. In fact, we've got to work together on all of these things. We're far too polarized in Washington right now. I mean, what we really do need to do in terms of the long-term deficit is get some control over the so-called entitlements. And they are growing very fast. Now, in a previous, when I was Secretary of Labor, I was also a trustee of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. And that means we used to meet with the actuaries about 2 or 3 times a year and look at the long-term spending for Medicare and for Social Security. And I remember sitting there, and it was about 12 or 13 years ago, and I'd sitting there, and I would see that according to the Medicare and also the Social Security trustees' projections, there would be not enough money to get through the 21st century. And I remember asking the actuaries, because in Washington, the actuaries, people who are the actuaries or people who are the numbers crunchers in places like the Congressional Budget Office, they have enormous power. And they really have the power. because they are crunching the numbers and talking about what the projections are, and everybody gets very nervous about the projections. So I said to these actuaries, I said, now I know that this looks very bleak, Social Security and Medicare, but what kind of growth assumptions, what are you assuming about the average rate of economic growth over the next 75 years? Because that's very, very important. And they would say back to me, well, we're assuming about 2.6% a year on average. Now, I knew a little bit something about economic history, and I said, but that's pretty conservative, because if you go back to the Civil War, the average yearly economic growth, even including the Great Depression, throw in the Great Depression, average out the economic growth over the last 100, 20, 30, 40 years, the average economic growth has been 3%. So why don't you put in 3%? And let me find out what happens to the numbers. And they came back, and they put in 3% into their calculations, and they came back, and it turns out Social Security was perfectly fine. There was no problem at all. Social Security would last all the way through the 21st century. And I said, well, why don't you use 3%? Because you're scaring people. They said, well, we want to be very conservative. All right, I understand that. But Medicare is the bear. Medicare, every time you hear about entitlements and the problem with entitlements, it's Medicare. It's not Social Security, it's really Medicare. And the big problem with Medicare is rising healthcare costs, and it is the baby boomers. The boomers. Anybody here born between, say, 1946 and 1964? Put up your hands. Anybody? A few of you. Now, you're called boomers. There are 77 million of us. I'm a very early boomer. I was born, why did we all begin booming in 1946? Because, well, my father, for example, was in the Second World War. And he came back, and there was my mother. You see, demographics it's not all that hard. This is not rocket science. And so you had in 1946 the beginning of this boom, and who was born in 1946 besides me? Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, 1946. Laura Bush, Ken Starr, Cher. I mean, anybody was born in 1946. And then the baby boom continued, and we have this big, I mean, it's a huge demographic bump going through. It's like, it's a great wave heading toward, and it's going to be crashing into the shores of retirement very soon. And that's the Medicare problem. It's a big part of the Medicare problem. But think of this wave, or think of a pig going through a python. No, go back to the wave. It's a wave, hits the shores of retirement, and the expectations of the boomers are completely unrealistic. I go around and I do a kind of free-floating focus group in terms of the boomer generation and what's going to happen and what are their retirement expectations. And a lot of them say, well, we are going to, and they give me a story, and I call it a med retirement. This is what they think of that they're going to have. A kind of a cross between a Club Med and a medical facility. No, really, I mean, snorkeling in the morning, extra oxygen in the afternoon. But there's no way that can be, because they haven't saved, and Social Security and Medicare, particularly Medicare, can't possibly do it. Now, some of the people who are looking at the deficit and looking at the baby boom, what they are really placing their bets on, and these are some people who are in high positions in the government, they say what's really going to happen and save us is that the deficit is not only going to go down, everything's going to go down because the dollar is going to drop. And as the dollar drops, Everything that we buy from the rest of the world is going to cost us so much more, and everything that they buy from us is going to cost them so much less that they will start buying more and more from us, and we will be buying less and less from them, and everything will balance out, and we'll be making more and more things, and we will be having more and more jobs, right? Well, the problem is the we, is the pronoun we. I mean, who is us, Kimosabi? Because you see, American companies are not American companies. They are all over the world. They are making things and doing things wherever they can do things more cheaply, most cheaply. When I was Secretary of Labor, my old car died. I went to get a new car. I didn't even think very much. I went to a Honda showroom, got a perfectly great Honda, or not, didn't get it. I kind of talked to the dealer, came back to the office, and I had a political assistant who said, Mr. Secretary, I understand you're thinking about buying a Honda. Let me remind you, and he was very, very subtle about this. He said, let me remind you, you are Secretary of Labor of the United States. And immediately I saw the subtlety of his logic, and I then turned around. Next weekend I went into a Ford showroom, and I found a car that was frankly almost as good. And I remember I stood there and I asked the dealer. The dealer was very cooperative, and I said, I know this has an American nameplate, Ford, and I'm very serious about it, but I need to know, honestly, was this car made here in the United States with American workers? And he looked at me for a long instant, trying to decide whether I was one of those or one of those. And finally he looked up at me with a smile and said, which would you prefer? You see, I mean, American companies are global companies, and they are making things or pieces or components all over the world wherever it is cheapest or wherever they can get the greatest expertise. And that is really the issue. It's cheapest or expertise. That's the long-term challenge we have. We can't be cheaper because that means a lower standard of living. So the only way we actually lift our standard of living is if we have more expertise. And that all goes back to education. Does it not? A few years ago, I had to have my hips replaced. And I was talking about globalization. You know, globalization is one of these words to have gone directly from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. I mean, I was talking about globalization, and I realized I had not made a very important and very personal, very, very, very intimate inquiry. I didn't know where and they are beautiful new hips. I can't show them to you, but you have to take my word. They're beautiful new hips. I didn't know where my new hips were made. It was almost, when I realized this, it was almost a kind of existential crisis. I didn't know who I was, in a way. And so I went back to the hospital where they had put them in, Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and they looked through the files, and they couldn't be sure, but they think that my beautiful new hips, beautiful, were made where they were fabricated in Germany. And they were designed in France. I have French designer hips. Actually, a few years ago I couldn't say that. So in other words, everything is coming from everywhere, and ultimately the question is, who has the learning, who has the expertise, who has the ability to do what in this increasingly integrated global economy? Our future standard of living and the future standard of living of our children will depend on our ability to add value to this increasingly integrated global world. That's what it all fundamentally boils down to. That's what it will boil down to. When we get out of this recession, and we will get out of the recession, that's what it boils down to. Now, there are a lot of issues. I mean, healthcare, for example. I am a huge, huge, huge supporter. And by the way, Michael, you're halfway right. I mean, I have criticized Obama, but I am a huge supporter of Obama. And I think one of the best things that I can do and you can do is help him criticize him, but also push him and help push the entire administration forward. And I think back on the presidential election of 1936, which I don't remember, but Franklin D. Roosevelt was pestered, and somebody, it was a re-election, and he said, and somebody came up to him, Mr. President, you must do this, and this, and this, and this. And he looked at this person and said, ma'am, I would like to do all of the things you are wanting me to do, but you must make me. You must make me. We have, politics is not a spectator sport. If we want Obama or anybody to do more or to do better, we've got to push in that direction. Now, the health care bill that is now winding its way through Congress, I think, is a good bill. I would have personally, given how I look at the world and given my values, but also given my understanding of health care, I would have preferred a single-payer system, honestly. I mean, here's the problem. We have the only healthcare system in the world right now, and it is the most inefficient. We spend more, but it's the only healthcare system based upon private for-profit insurance companies competing against each other. Now, it's not surprising that we have the only health insurance in the world that is designed to avoid sick people. And market to healthy people. One of the most important aspects, there are good things in that bill. There are a lot of very good things in the bill. The preventing insurance companies from not giving somebody insurance because of pre-existing conditions, for example. A lot of good things. The public option, to me, I think the public option is quite important. But ultimately, a lot of our health care bill, and they're going up very fast. In 1980, we were spending about 8% of our whole GDP on healthcare. Now it's up to 16%. It's just heading like this, and everybody is paying more. But one of the most important aspects, and this is what I am looking for, is prevention. We've got to make sure that people get good medical assistance and primary care providers get to see people, and we get to prevent diseases from developing into the kind of costly diseases we have now. Too many of our people obese and everything else. My father, and I've mentioned him before, my father began walking when he was 80 years old. He began walking 5 miles a day. He is going to be 96 in February, and we have no idea where he is. No, that's not true. We know where he is, and he has taken prevention, and really, I do believe prevention is critically important to all of this. Now, where are we going? I want to make some predictions now, and I want to talk about the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years. I want to warn you about something, but before I do, let me just predict about right now. I want to take your question. When I finish here, and I'm going to finish very soon, I want to take your questions. So we've preserved, I hope, enough time for your questions. And if I've provoked any questions, please write them down and we'll have a discussion. I like, in a classroom, I don't learn anything by lecturing. I learn by the interaction with my students. And so I'm going to learn a lot by interacting with you in a moment. But let me just say, I developed, and here's the warning about my predictions, I have developed a reputation over the years as being something of a soothsayer, an economic soothsayer. And it is not particularly well deserved. It comes from, all of it comes from, my whole reputation, really as a soothsayer, comes from what I said in the first week of October of 1987. Now, does anybody here remember what happened the third week of October of 1987? Relative to what's been going on now, it may not seem like much, but it really was quite shocking at the time. But in the first week of 1987, of October 1987, I was on a television program with somebody opposite me, an economist whose name I shall not reveal, because I don't want to embarrass him. But the question was, what's going to happen to this extraordinary bull market over the next couple of months? I mean, it was really a huge bull market, as some of you remember. And once he heard the question, he started first, and he got almost foamed at the mouth. He said, over the next month and the next 2 months, it's going to be just fabulous. Don't even wait till this program ends to call your broker. and get in deeper. I mean, just get in. You won't regret it. Get in. And then it came to my turn, and I said, he's wrong. I mean, I can't tell you exactly, but I believe in 2 weeks. No, this is true. There's a tape of this program. In 2 weeks, the market is going to lose 20% of its value. And so I would get out as fast as you can. Don't even wait to the end of this program to call your broker. In retrospect, I don't think anybody saw the end of the program, because either way, and so 2 weeks passed, and then the market lost 17, 18, 19% of its value. And I was deluged with telephone calls and letters and communication, people wanting to know how to sign up for my investment letter. And I told them with a great deal of regret. I mean, there's money to be made, but I didn't have an investment letter. And I told them that. But what I did not tell them at the time, and my reputation sort of as a soothsayer depends on this, so I appreciate it if what I'm about to tell you, you could keep in this room, all right? Will you give me that assurance? That forecast I made that in 2 weeks the market would lose 20% of its value, I had been making exactly the same forecast for 4.5 years. Which just goes to prove, in the economic forecasting business, if you stick to your guns, eventually you can have your own economic newsletter or whatever. So what do I think is going to happen? Here's what I think is going to happen. In 2 weeks, no. Here's what I think is going to happen. I think, and again, I want to be very realistic with you about this. The essential problem, and one of the themes you want to take away from tonight, is that there are really two problems. One's a short-term problem, relatively speaking, and the second is a long-term problem. The short-term problem, relatively speaking, is that there's not enough aggregate demand in the system. Why? Because consumers for years have not had a raise, and the only way they continued to spend was going deeper and deeper into debt. But now those days are over, and consumers cannot go deeper and deeper into debt. And by the way, you might be asking yourself, when I said that at the beginning of this program, you might now be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, the economy continued to grow over the last 30 years, a lot. But if the median wage stayed pretty flat, what happened to all the growth? And the answer is class. It went to the top. Now, by the way, when I say this, sometimes I say this, people accuse me of being a class warrior. Now, I'm not blaming anybody for this. I'm not blaming people at the top. I mean, nobody is culpable here. It's just the fact of the matter is that, and in fact, one of my colleagues at Berkeley just did a very, very, very detailed analysis of tax records from 1913 onward. And as recently as 1980, this just gives you where things are. Recently as 1980, the top 1% was taking home about 8.5% of total national income. But then from 1980 on, there was a greater and greater concentration. The top got more and more of the gains from economic growth. And so in 2007, the top 1% took home over 23% of total national income. Now, when the top is taking home that much of total national, well, you can say, why don't the top spend as much as everybody else? Well, being rich means you already have most of what you need. That's the definition of being rich. You don't have to go out and spend all of your income. The last time in history, there was another time in history when, one other time in history, from 1913 onward, when the top 1% was taking home over 23% of total national income. The year was 1928. By the way, that economist who was arguing with me on that program, I won't mention his name. Arthur Laffer. But I just want to make sure you understand the short-term problem is a lack of aggregate demand, and that lack of aggregate demand has something to do with the fact that the middle class has not, over the years, been able to get enough income to turn around and spend it without going into debt. And now that the debt bubble is gone, that aggregate demand problem is going to be with us for a while. It's not going to be with us forever, because look, we have a stimulus package, and people have got to eventually replace their cars and their big consumer durables and their washing machines, and people, things break down. And on top of that, inventories are dropping, and so businesses have got to reorder. So there is going to be a pickup. There is going to inevitably be a recovery. The question is how strong a recovery, and how long will the recovery last? And that is where I get a little concerned. Because I think it's not, some people say it's going to be a V-shaped. I don't think it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. You're not going to see a fast recovery like we had in, say, 1982, because the recession of 1980-81, that recession was brought on primarily by the Fed raising interest rates so high that it closed down the economy. And so by the time interest rates started to come down again, there was a lot of pent-up demand. And there was a lot of pent-up demand after the Great Recession. But remember, we're now dealing with an asset bubble that blew up, and there is not very much pent-up demand. It's very different. Very, very different. I don't want to be gloomy and doomy. I see that I can watch your faces. You're getting very unhappy, and I'm sorry about this. But anyway, we will get out of it. And then the longer term, and I think, to me, more serious problem has to do with our capacity, our education, our human capital, our capacity to add value to the world economy, our schools. I am in what I consider to be the best system, the best university of public higher education in perhaps the world. Maybe you will dispute it, but there are some UCal grads here. Go Bears. Anyway, but state legislatures are pulling in for all state public higher education. And look, let's face it, 0 through 5 education, we don't really have much in early childhood education, and our K through 12 systems around the country are in quite miserable shape. I don't mean money is the answer, but certainly you've got to, if you want talented people to go into teaching, the law of supply and demand is not repealed at the schoolhouse door. If we want talented people to go into teaching, we're going to have to, whether they are men or women, we're going to have to pay them to go into teaching. And so that's the long-term problem. So, but let me just stop on this note, and I want to make it a positive note. Because I feel positively. I mean, when we in this country understand the nature of a problem, regardless of whether we are conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, we roll up our sleeves, we are very, very practical, we get on with whatever has to be done. The problem and the real issue is knowing and agreeing on the nature of the problem. That is the problem. And I think that we are on the verge of knowing and agreeing on the nature of the problem. It's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. I call it it's going to be kind of a square root recovery. Or from your perspective, and in 2 weeks, no. But in the long run, we are going to be just fine. And as the great British economist John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And now for your questions. And Jessie has a microphone, and she is going, just put up your hands, just put up your hands. And Jessie has a microphone. She's going to, that's one mic. There may be another mic.
There's just one microphone, and we only have a few minutes, so please keep your questions extremely brief and limit it to one question.
Yes.
We went from the caves to the moon. Let's say we appreciate what Harry Stack Sullivan, the late psychiatrist, said, whether you're rich or poor, young or old, etc., one or the other, we're more simply human than otherwise. Is there anything we cannot accomplish if we all share the same values about sex, politics, and religion, and if we all believe in the idea, united we stand, divided we will have further avoidable problems? Professor.
Stand up.
Next question. No, look, I think that, again, you're absolutely right. If we are together on our definition of the problem, and we will prevail. I mean, I think that as more people understand the nature of the problem, and I hate these sort of labels. That we label each other, we polarize each other, liberal, conservative. I go on these yelling programs on television, and I'm pitted against somebody who's called a conservative, and I'm supposed to yell. I remember recently I was talking to somebody, somebody who was on the other side of something, and we were trying to have a civilized discussion, and we got to a station break, a commercial break, and in my ear I heard the producer, and the producer said, Professor Reich, yes, she said, be angrier. I said, what do you mean, be angrier? She said, we want more, just more anger. We want more anger because of anger. I said, why? Anger gets more eyeballs, and more eyeballs gets more commercials, and more commercial. And I said, I'm not going to be angrier. She said, we really want you to be angry. I said, I'm not going to be angry. And that. So we are, we had these gladiator contests on television, and it's very humorous, it's very fun, but it has nothing to do with the real world of Washington, and it has nothing to do with the real world of people who are citizens getting together who have different views and talking. Yes, next question.
Over here.
It's been very entertaining, and it's nice to hear you say that things are going to get better. Can you give us some specifics as to how it's going to get better?
Well, if you followed my logic, we're not going to be able to sustain an economy that is based on 71% consumer spending. Now, as recently as 15 years ago, it was only about 65%. Now, what did we do for the rest? Well, there was more export, and I think we will have more export markets, and I think we do have to push China a little bit to allow the yuan to appreciate. That's a gigantic export market, and it's a very delicate relationship, but we do have to do that. I think business investment is critically important, and I think business investment, maybe we have to provide a little bit more incentives for business investment. That is not necessarily, that's not wrong. Again, the question is how much investment is there going to be without consumers? Government, that's the interesting question. How far can government go in terms of a stimulus? Can we have a second stimulus? And how far can we go? And there is not just an issue of the deficit. It's also an issue of taxation. Because we cannot raise taxes on the middle class if we want people to spend. They just don't have the money. But can we do an assortment of different things that enables people to have more purchasing power? For example, suppose we were to exempt the first $15,000 or $20,000 of income from the payroll tax and raise the cap on the proportion of income subjected to Social Security and payroll taxes. Would that be a bad thing? I'm not sure it would be bad. Supposing we were going to means test a little bit Social Security. Would that be terrible? Supposing we were going to, in terms of reform of entitlements, raise a little bit the age, the eligibility age for Social Security. Would that be terrible? You know, Social Security was created in 1935, and in 1935, my predecessor, Francis Perkins, at the Department of Labor, said, well, let's make it start at the age of 65. That was fine, but the average lifespan in 1935 was 61 years. It wasn't such a great deal. But now most of us last to 80 years, and maybe we can raise again. We've raised it once, maybe we can raise the... In other words, a lot of things that can be done. Now, I'm going to say something terribly that will annoy some of you and maybe drive you completely crazy, but I'll say it anyway because we're all friends. It is possible. I don't say this is desirable, but it is possible to raise the marginal tax rate on the very rich. Now it is going up anyway, to some extent, and certainly some states, like California, is very high. But I say that only because we tend to forget that the marginal tax, I'm not suggesting what I'm about to tell you historically, but we tend to forget that under the Eisenhower administration, and nobody talked about Dwight Eisenhower as a radical. But the marginal tax rate on the highest incomes was 91% under the Eisenhower administration. I mean, now it's a big fight. Is it going to be 28 or 30 or 35? Are you going to go 36, maybe 38? 91%. So there are a lot of things that can be done to provide the funding for the government to do more public investment. Maybe on the environment. Maybe improve our alternative energy sources. Maybe improve our public health. A lot of things that can be done, we can't do individually, and that would sustain aggregate demand at the same time, create jobs at the same time. All right. Yes?
Today, sorry.
Oh, hello.
Paul Krugman came out today in favor of a new WPA. What do you think of that?
Who came out in favor?
Paul Krugman, I think he won a Nobel Prize and I'm sorry. Whatever his name is.
I think that a new WPA would be a good idea. In fact, for those of you who want to, this is a little commercial. Right now on YouTube, you can see I've been doing these video logs, video logs. They're like blogs, but they're video blogs. They're called vlogs. And I have on YouTube a vlog about what to do about the jobs crisis. And right there, and I mean, and dozens of people have watched it. I mean, it's basically gone viral. But if you watch it, you'll see that I make the case for a new WPA. We have time for a couple more. Yes, Jesse, you're back there.
You can hear this? All right. You talk about government and the need for government to do everything it can do, but we have such polarization today with the inability for our Congress and our people up there to do anything together. What would you suggest? How can we get our government to do what we must have it do when we can't get our government to come together to do anything?
Well, let me say, first of all, there is certainly more polarization on Capitol Hill and in Washington than there was when I was Secretary of Labor, and when I first went to Washington in the late 70s working for a man named Robert Bork. And that was in the Justice Department, and he and I, well, it turned out that he and I did not see eye to eye on the First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, Eighth, and Ninth Amendments. Other than that, there was a marriage made in heaven. And, but there was a lot of people in those days, there was a lot of discussion and agreement among Republicans and Democrats. People were friends. They saw each other outside of work hours. Even when I was Secretary of Labor, I made my best friend in Washington, bar none, was Alan Simpson, a Republican senator from Wyoming. But my staff, when I said I wanted to have lunch with Alan Simpson, they said, "You can't." I said, "Why can't I?" "No, you can't. And he told me that his staff, when he said he wanted to have lunch with me, his secretary said, his staff said, "You can't do that." So we ended up sneaking out. It was like an affair. So yes, there's much too much polarization in Washington, but that comes in turn from a public who is highly polarized. And why are we so polarized? I think partly because we see it modeled. I mentioned this already in terms of the gladiator contests on television. Partly because we are all in bubbles. We talk to people and read magazines and read newspapers, all of which reaffirm our basic assumptions. We tend not to talk to people. We tend not to want to talk to people. We tend not to want to read things or see things that call into question our basic assumptions. I went from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I lived for more than 20 years, to Berkeley, California, the entire spectrum of America. And in Berkeley, California, it is another bubble, and people, I can't believe, I'm on the street and I see a demonstration. And people are holding plaques and they're saying, honk if you want peace. I've recommended something that nobody's taken seriously yet, but it's a sister city program in which you have Berkeley and maybe Oklahoma City. Really, and people have pen pals and email, and they get to know each other, and they talk about healthcare and taxes, but because we're only going to get out of this when we start actually talking to other people, listening to other people outside our bubbles. So on that very upbeat note, I see my time is up. Thank you all so much for coming tonight.